So let's start the second panel. Today we have two papers from Brittney and Angela Duffett. And our commentator today is Professor Jane Ellington. So I'll quickly say a few words about the speakers first and then introduce our commentator. Brittney Ann is a fourth-year PhD student, and she arrived here at Queen's in 2010 after completing her bachelor's and master's from Carleton University. And she's working on a very interesting doctoral dissertation where she's drawing from a number of different disciplines, including gender studies, also art history, cultural memory, Canadian studies, and looking at performative aspects of identity formation in a cross-disciplinary perspective. More specifically, she's asking how monuments perform identities and how such performative aspects lead towards a broader articulation of a wider identity. Second speaker, Angela Duffett, is also a fourth-year PhD. She also arrived here in 2010, having finished an MA from Carleton in Public History. Angela's dissertation is entitled, "I have found the town very much improved, Sociability, Performance and Identity in St. John's, Newfoundland, 1816 to 1860. And the project looks at social life, merchant families in 19th century St. John's. Interestingly, Angela, apart from her core research, has worked on a number of interesting historic sites that include the Parliament buildings, the Beaumont Hamel First World War memorials in France, and the library and archives in Canada. And she's currently working at the library, at the archives at Queen's University. And as you must know, Angela is an active and important member of the GHSA and was the co-chair of last year's Magdalene Queen's graduate conference. I would also like to say a few words about Professor Jane Ellington, who is the commentator for this panel. And Professor Ellington will also be chairing the panel. So she's a distinguished historian of colonial North America and is a professor in our department and used to be a dean at the Faculty of Arts at Royal Military College. Professor Ellington is the author of numerous articles on aspects of intellectual history and social history in Upper Canada in the early 19th century, including 3 award-winning books. And the most recent one was entitled Immigrant Worlds and Transatlantic Communities, published in 2007. She's currently working on 2 projects. The first one is called A Study of Church and Charity in the first half of the 19th century. And the second one is a study of the making of the Royal Military College, RMC, tentatively entitled Imperial Masculinity. And I suspect that's the basis, was the basis of the talk that she delivered at the faculty lecture last year. So that is the panel, and with those brief introductions, I'll turn to Brittney Ann for the first paper, roughly about 25 minutes or so.
Thank you. The paper I'm presenting today is actually based off of the first section of my dissertation and is thus representative of 2 larger chapters. So it's a rather ambitious presentation to put into 20 minutes. The entire dissertation project outlines the narrative of colonizing memories, a process that transformed through the late 19th century and into the 20th century. And due to the size of this first section and the short length of this presentation, this particular version is very compressed and therefore heavily focused on the analytical components rather than the historical background. So there is some historical background missing in this particular presentation. And also to account for the shortened length, the bulk of this analysis is centered on a direct comparison of 2 monuments rather than individual nuances of those 2. So first I will introduce you to these 2 monuments. Now, this paper argues that the monuments to Sir Isaac Brock and Joseph Brant are representative of hero-making efforts in Ontario during the mid to late 19th century. Now, evidence of hero-making is not only found in the historical documents relating to the monuments and their unveilings, but also in the visual forms themselves. Now, this paper weaves in visual analysis to demonstrate that hero-making was not only present in these commemorations, but was actually one of the primary motivating factors in their creation. Now, despite their many differences, both as historical figures and as remembered individuals, the commemorated heroes of Sir Isaac Brock and Joseph Brant were intended to provide demonstrative examples and imperial symbols for their respective communities. Both monuments reflect the period in which they were created and ultimately reveal a complex web of tangled memories inscribed in stone and bronze that forever altered the commemorative landscape of Ontario. Now, the monument to Sir Isaac Brock has a complicated history, and as the one that currently stands at Queenston Heights is not only the second version of the monument, but was also one of many designs formally chosen. So far I've found 5 different accepted monuments, and as we see, we only have one today. An original design, I'm showing here, was adapted because the first design was an elaborate column with reliefs, a mausoleum at the top where Sir Isaac Brock's remains were supposed to be, and it was immediately conceptualized in 1812. However, that design proved very costly, and eventually it was scaled down into something that was far more simplistic. And that's what we see here, a more simplistic Tuscan column by Francis Hall, which was officially started following the second funeral of Sir Isaac Brock in 1824. Now, that column didn't stand very long. It was bombed in April of 1840, supposedly by Benjamin Lett, a participant in the 1837 rebellion. So although a mass meeting was held immediately after this bombing, work on the monument's repair was very slow. They didn't apply for money from the Dominion. That meant they needed to actually raise some funds, which took a long time. Now, this building committee was made up of prominent citizens from Upper Canada, including a number of generals, politicians, and many of these knew Brock personally, and also members of the family compact. So in 1842, a competition for the design was held, and over 35 different applications were received. The winning design was an Egyptian obelisk, and that was by Thomas Young. However, apparently, due to a lack of funding, once again, the monument was delayed. And enough interest had been accrued on the original investment, so they began to start again in 1852. But rather than choose the original design by Thomas Young, they held another competition. And in this competition, William Thomas was chosen as the architect. Now, his design is what we see at Queenston Heights today, completed in around 1857. Now, from his death in 1812, the final unveiling in 1857, there were at least 7 large-scale commemorative ceremonies at the site to Sir Isaac. 7, not including the actual building of the monuments. Since that time, the centennial and bicentennial have also attracted large crowds and large reinterpretations. Now, the monument to Joseph Brant didn't quite have such a complicated beginning. The original idea for the monument came from the Six Nations around the area of Brantford, and in a letter presented to Prince Arthur in 1874 during his visit to the Six Nations Reserve, band leaders prepared a letter outlining the loyalism of Joseph Brant and his deserving a memorial from the Empire. Now, according to the Brantford Expositor, the prince replied with a very favorable reply, but no money was pledged to the project. So 2 years later, in 1876, the project gained new momentum thanks to a large donation from the Six Nations, and a local committee was founded. As with the Brock Monument, local and national politicians were chosen for the executive posts, while local businessmen and community members made up the General Assembly. Notably, at least 10 chiefs from various nations across Ontario were chosen to sit on the original committee. In 1880, a design was received that curiously looked like the first Brock monument, a large column surmounted by a figure of Brant. However, you guessed it, due to a small amount of funds, they had to reject that design. So by 1884, there was a new competition, and Percy Wood, a sculptor from England, won that competition, and his design is the one present on the site. The eventual monument was set up over the course of the summer of 1886, and finally unveiled in October of that year. Now, based on the meeting minutes and newspaper reports available, along with correspondences between the Brock Monument Committee members, it appears that both groups were very concerned with the appearance of the final design. And this appearance, ideally, was meant to link the heroism of the individual to the glory of the empire. In a letter from 1843, William Hamilton Merritt, a committee member, wrote to the secretary of the committee, Colonel Richard Bullock. And in this letter, Merritt points out that a column was the only suitable choice for Brock's monument, and he rather aggressively argued that no similar design existed anywhere in America. As other scholars have noticed, the design for the Washington Monument was just released, and there was a real concern that an obelisk had been chosen, and therefore an obelisk could not be Brock's monument as well. And when the committee reconvened in 1852 for the new design competition, Merritt had a more prominent position. And despite the submission of another obelisk design by Thomas Young, it was William Thomas's column that was chosen, not the American-looking obelisk. By now a well-known Toronto architect, well connected with that family compact, William Thomas had long before lost a competition to build Nelson's monument in London, England, which looks curiously the same as Brock's. Now, of course, Thomas Young was well suited to build his own column for the empire. But why a column? Both columns and obelisks are prominent features in the British commemorative landscape, but the column eventually took over in popularity during the Napoleonic Wars. And suddenly, nearly every city, town, village had a column to mark those heroes. Alison Yarrington, a British art historian, explores the use of the British Triumphal column during this particular period, and notes that due to its Roman and Greek references, these build forms were meant to link ancient heroism with contemporary figures, something Enlightenment writers were also interested in. Now, the sculpted images of winged victory and laurel wreaths on the Brock Monument make sure that this connection is quite clear. It is thus even more interesting that the commemorators of Joseph Brant initially considered a columnar design. According to multiple newspaper reports and one correspondence, this design was chosen simply due to that lack of funds. There was great praise given for this column. Now, this original design would have been very similar to Brock's column, but noticeably without the Roman elements. So the artist proposed replacing the Roman soldiers that we see at the base of Brock's monument and other monuments from the period, such as the one in Nelson's on the left, with figures of the Six Nations. So instead of having Roman soldiers guard the monument, they were meant to be the Six Nations. And instead of laurel decorating the tops of the monument, it was going to be the natural flora of Canada. Even in a distinctly triumphant and British columnar design, Joseph Brant was always meant to be tied to his particular place, one that was decidedly not quite British. Nonetheless, the design for Brant's monument was carefully planned, carefully chosen, and due to the missing meeting minutes from the committee, I've had to rely on newspaper reports of those meetings and a few correspondences with the Prime Minister's office, both of which have been thankfully quite detailed. Now, the original design submitted by Percy Wood appears to be nearly exactly the same as the final monument. There is one drawing of his submission. The original design, Percy Wood, when he received the original package for the design competition, would have received a few portraits of Joseph Brant, most likely a famous image by George Romney and another, as well as photographs of the Six Nations in, I quote, ceremonial clothing. Unfortunately, these images did not survive in the package, and thus we don't know what images he did receive. Now, while the final design is similar to portrait statues appearing throughout the empire, Canada and overseas at the time, there are features that mark it as specifically Canadian or First Nations and not quite British. Close, but not quite. For example, the figures around the base, as I mentioned, are not Roman soldiers, they're not gods or goddesses, they're not personifications of liberty or freedom. These usually appear at the base of portrait statues of this period. Rather, they are representatives of the First Nations, and also the group, as I mentioned, that donated the largest percentage of money for the project, over 1/3. Now the bas reliefs, a little bit difficult to see, appear on the sides of the monument, and they also mark this type of iconography and look fairly similar to the bas reliefs on the Brock monument. However, what's a little bit different is the other bas reliefs, they don't portray classical military ornaments, but rather it's images of Canadian fauna, some Canadian flora, and also the animal totems of the Six Nations. Now, the unveiling ceremonies for both monuments, as well as the decisions leading up to the programs, also demonstrate that commemorators were interested in creating heroes for their own communities. And the memory of Brock and the multiple ceremonies after his death underwent a noticeable shift from 1812 to 1857. The early funerals of 1812 and 1824 were populated by generals, soldiers, and citizens, many of which personally knew Brock. They were able to give first-hand accounts and speeches, and they were able to talk about their own connections with the conduct of Brock. Speeches and commentary from these funerals, relayed through extensive newspaper reports about them, speak to Brock's personal connections to individuals, his role in the Battle of Queenston Heights, and his competence as a military general. There's a distinct focus in these commemorations of the battle itself, and also his military role. The immediacy of his death meant that Brock was not yet quite a hero. This status of hero needed time to be conferred upon him. It was clear that commemorators recognized his leadership and his military prowess, and the hero-making had indeed already begun. But Brock wasn't permitted the status of hero quite yet. His life and death had to pass into the realm of myth first. While many of Brock's contemporaries were on that original committee to rebuild the monument, and were certainly present in the 1840 grand spectacle meeting at Queenston, by the 1853 funeral and eventually unveiling in 1857, few were left alive. So with less living memory of Brock and more development of the myth surrounding his life and death, the heroism of Brock became increasingly emphasized. Starting in 1840, members of the Family Compact and other citizens with connections to elite groups dominated the committee to rebuild the monument. Their influence was especially manifested in the 1853 reinterment. First, there was an increasing anti-American sentiment that was not as apparent in the early commemorations. Starting in 1840 and growing intensity by 1856, it became clear that Brock's memory was to be framed by the British counterparts. While the word hero is not found too much in the newspaper report of the event, there is considerably more discussion about Brock's talents as a leader. Now, in my larger dissertation, I argue that during this period, Brock becomes a manifestation of the British gentleman hero, a specific type of heroism that had its origins in commemorations of the Napoleonic Wars. In this example, the hero is remembered for his leadership and statesmanship together, along with discourse about his more humanitarian qualities, the ability to provide for regular soldiers and militia, to fight for those who had no voice, in this case the First Nations, and to have moral qualities of mercy, chivalry, and self-regulation. It was clear that by 1853, the heroism of Brock was to be framed within the qualities of the British gentleman hero. Because there were much fewer commemorations for Joseph Brant, he did not undergo the same type of transformation that Brock did. Nonetheless, as his living memory became further removed, the status of hero was also conferred on Brant. However, it was clear from its onset that the type of hero Brant was meant to represent was framed by similar ideologies of Brock, despite their racial differences. Since Brant was never able to become fully British, this frame of heroism was limited, but was thus adapted. The extensive spread in the Brantford Expositor following the monument's unveiling in 1886 documents the various speeches given at the ceremony. In all accounts, Brant is remembered, by none who knew him personally, as a loyal British, never called Canadian, subject. It appears that this rhetoric of remembrance started almost immediately after his death. The first inscription on the original tomb was erected by those who admired, quote, his fidelity and attachment to the British crown, end quote. By 1886, the loyalty of Brant was also applied to the Six Nations. The inscription on the monument reads, in part, to the Six Nations for their long and faithful service to the British crown and their strict observance to treaties. The remembered loyalism of Brant is the primary contributing factor that allowed him to become a hero. Joseph Brant was set in sharp contrast with other First Nations groups that were not seen as loyal subjects of the British crown. The Northwest Rebellion had occurred only a year before the unveiling, and the Brantford exposures were reported on the Brant Memorial Committee meetings right alongside news of the rebellion in 1885. Riel's execution was also reported in the newspaper, utilizing language that was in stark contrast to the praise being bestowed on Brant. It was quite clear that Joseph Brant's loyalism made him a hero within this British rhetoric. In fact, in 1886, Brant's military accomplishments were downplayed, similar to how Brock was transformed into a statesman as well. The qualities emphasized by commemorators in 1886 included hardiness, fidelity, majesty, honor, and an heir to command. Despite having the qualities of his British heroic counterparts, Brant is still a warrior. Speeches note that he was more like a general and born to lead like a general. Therefore, although he was like a general, he was still a warrior, a status reserved for him as Six Nations. Brant is also not fully British in his physical form. His costuming is overly othered and not like any portraits completed during his life. The notable hybrid costuming that Brant is remembered to have adopted and also captured in George Romney's famous portrait is completely missing from the monument's depiction. Instead, Brant is decked out in pan-Indian costume, an imagined dress, more closely tied to the nation's plains rather than the Six Nations, and doesn't appear in any portraits of him painted during his life. Although his figure is othered in costume and even in demeanor, his body is literally British. The bronze used to cast the figures comes from 12 melted cannons from the Battle of Waterloo, donated by Her Majesty. In conclusion, the monuments to Sir Isaac Brock and Joseph Brant are representative of the developing commemorative landscape in 19th century Ontario. This landscape is characterized by the desire or need to create heroes for the young, soon-to-be nation. This nation needed its own heroes, those that were British themselves, maybe, maybe not, but they borrowed from British hero-making rhetoric. Both Sir Isaac Brock and Joseph Brant were military men, transformed into statesmen, loyal to the British crown, and possessing virtues reflecting 19th century heroism. Although Joseph Brant was positioned as an other, his loyalism allowed his figure to become a commemorated figure, a partial access to the same heroic rhetoric that was bestowed on Brock. Thus, both Brock and Brant can be positioned within the same commemorative landscape, a memorial space that continued to grow and develop into the early 20th century. But that's the next chapter.
Hello all, thank you for having me here this afternoon. My talk today is called Unspeakably Colonial, Landscape and Identity in 19th Century St. John's, Newfoundland. And I'm just going to sort of take the opportunity this afternoon to sort of just give you a run through of the larger dissertation project and some of the elements of landscape and identity that I'm working on integrating throughout the project. So I'll start with a story about a man named Richard Morris, who arrived in St. John's in the spring of 1820 for his 4th summer fishing season on the island. He was a clerk in the London-based merchant firm of Hoyles, Brown and Company. And shortly after arriving that spring, Richard wrote to his sister Anne, who lived in London, that I have found this town very much improved. And he added that I'm better pleased with this place every time I come to it, and if I ever leave England, I think it will be to come here. This was quite an about-face for a man who only 3 years previously described Newfoundland as, quote, a wild country covered with fish and fishermen, end quote. Richard went on to describe the amusements and activities that had been established in the town since his first arrival in 1817. An amateur theater, horse races, an opera performance, and a fair were among the events he attended in the summer of 1820. Richard's description of the city and of his social calendar reflect the transformation that occurred in St. John's in the early years of the 19th century, as merchants increasingly headquartered their fishing operations out of St. John's rather than out of Britain. With its growing population of year-round residents, St. John's began to take on the appearance and infrastructure of a colonial town rather than that of a temporary summer fishing outpost. Richard Morris would be among these new permanent residents. Satisfied with life in the town, in 1820 he fulfilled his employer's request that he stay there the rest of the year rather than returning to work in the London office during the winter. Although he occasionally mused about returning to England, and did return for business and pleasure several times throughout his life, Richard married in St. John's, established a home there, and appeared content with the life he led on that side of the Atlantic. Richard's immigration to and life in St. John's are representative of many first-generation permanent settlers to the city, with his letters portraying many of their concerns, desires, and anxieties. In Richard Morris's case, his preoccupation with social activities and his descriptions of the city can be perceived as reflecting colonial desires to emulate metropolitan norms. Having moved their businesses and families across the Atlantic, St. John's merchants and other middle-class professionals became concerned with establishing the sorts of social events and activities they'd participated in Britain, or in the case of the upwardly mobile, activities that they felt befit their newly acquired status as respectable professional men. Their attempts to craft and create a town that reflected their values and ideals are a major focal point of my thesis. Indeed, as these men and sometimes women remade themselves in North America, they actively attempted to restructure and reorganize the community around them to reflect their ideals. As colonial governor Richard Keats put it in an 1814 report, during the early years of the century, St. John's, quote, became the emporium of the island and changed its character from a fishery to a considerable commercial town, end quote. What growing pains does a place go through when a professional class who previously administered their business from afar descends upon it? Hence, the city itself and its geography become just as important a character in my study as any of the men and women surveyed. A major wave of immigration in the early part of the century, and I'll bring up a map here just in case any of you don't know where St. John's is. A major wave of immigration in the early, not St. John's, New Brunswick, in the early part of the century resulted in the resident population of the community increasing from about 3,800 permanent residents in 1800 to 15,000 by 1836 and 25,000 by 1850. And I think it's important to note as well that this is really probably the only major wave of immigration to the city and to the island as a whole. And in response to this increasing population, a resident rather than seasonal governor was appointed to Newfoundland in 1818. People start to advocate for representative government and later responsible government. And the city grows from trading outposts to an increasingly complex community where newly established newspapers report on banquets, club meetings, church events, and other occasions, in addition to political developments. So my project as a whole focuses on the social lives and linkages of men like Richard Morris and of the second and third generations who followed them, examining their involvement in clubs, voluntary societies, charting how they used these spaces to create and reinforce a discourse of middle-class respectability. It also looks at the physical spaces occupied by clubs themselves within the city's built environment, by analyzing parades, ceremonies, church openings and church construction, and other events at which people moved through the city, performing identities in order to stake claim to certain spaces. How did people create the imagined communities of club, church, city, and colony at the same time as they laid claim to and created physical space for those communities? How did the physical space reflect the imagined, and vice versa? And I think St. John's makes a particularly interesting case study of a colonial town. A lot of these questions are not unique to St. John's, Newfoundland, but I think there are some things about St. John's as a town and its location and the nature of colonial life there that make it a very interesting case study. St. John's geographic location is a trade center isolated in the winter and connected to the wider Atlantic world in the summer, undergoing a very quick demographic and political transformation during the period under consideration, makes it an ideal case study. It's a bowl-shaped sort of city, and I started to borrow a lot of organizational ideas from Rice Isaac's book, The Transformation of Virginia. And although it's about a very different geographic and temporal subject than my own, his methodologies of landscape, performance, and experience, I think, can really be transposed to this setting. In this bowl-shaped city, all buildings were oriented towards the Narrows, which was the thin entrance in and out of the harbor. Because there were no roads in and out of the city, all news and information also flowed in and out from the harbor. The view of the harbor greeted each new arrival to the city and was the last image that those departing took with them as they left the colony. When governors, dignitaries, or bishops arrived in St. John's, their arrival would be publicized, and they would delay coming ashore until newspapers were able to announce their arrival an hour of debarkation. On arriving, they would be greeted at the wharf by crowds, but the crowd was, of course, not amorphous. The crowd had its own degree of order, organization, and distinction. Groups such as the Benevolent Irish Society and the Natives Society, which was a political group of native-born, by which they mean settler-born, who advocated for greater political authority. Groups like this would come down to the waterfront and wave wands and wear rosettes and march under silk banners to greet or show their lack of greeting to whoever was coming. When a particularly eminent visitor came ashore, such as the Prince of Wales, who visited in 1860, special viewing places were set aside for politicians, members of various clubs, clergy, ladies, and school children. Depending on their proximity to power, groups would march behind the visitors, accompanying a governor to Government House and witnessing his swearing in, or accompanying the bishop to the episcopal residence, presenting him with an address and cheering him on. These events, of course, provided the setting for elaborate demonstrations of performativity. Club members, for example, would dress for the occasion beforehand. They would meet with their compatriots at a clubhouse and march through the streets to the wharf. They would make the city their stage on which to perform, a space to see and a space to be seen. In 1870, Mrs. Catherine Rennie, returning from an extended journey to England and Scotland to visit friends and family, found herself on board the same ship returning from England as Roman Catholic Bishop John Thomas Mullock. She concluded her travel diary with a description of the harbor and the reception awaiting the bishop. Quote, "The approach to the Narrows had a singularly grand appearance. The sun shone so dazzlingly, and as far as the eye could reach, banners floating in the breeze amidst such profusion of evergreens and archways in the direction of the principal street in connection with the pier or landing stage. All was principally in honor of his lordship, the Catholic bishop, who came out in the steamer with us." End quote. For Mrs. Rennie, the public excitement awaiting the bishop's arrival was reflected in her family's excitement at greeting her. Quote, "I was received with all honors myself by my dear ones, the house all cleaned up and papered with numbers of fine pictures added to the old stock, and all so cheery, showing how much cared for and thought of I was." End quote. Mrs. Rennie's diary provides a perspective on the sights and sounds that would have dominated St. John's Harbor on an auspicious occasion such as the bishop's homecoming. Mrs. Rennie's description of the crowd awaiting Bishop Mullock in 1870 is a unique glimpse into what the reception scene would have looked like from shipboard. Bishop Edward Field also provided an account of what it felt like to be met with such pomp upon one's arrival, recording in his diary his very unenthused opinion about the reception he met with on his arrival in Newfoundland in 1844. As the ship carrying Field entered the harbor, it was approached by 3 smaller boats. One was sent by Governor Sir John Harvey and directed by his eldest son. Another carried the city's 2 Anglican ministers and their church wardens. And the third was manned by Captain Elliot of HMS Eurydice at anchor in the harbor. The 2 clergymen left their boat and joined Field on board of his steamship. They then directed him into the governor's boat, which they also entered. The church wardens stayed in their boat and addressed and welcomed Field. The governor's boat conveyed Field to the Queen's Wharf, where he was met by about 70 men and officers of the Royal Newfoundland Companies. "I made my best bow," Field noted, "and that, I fear, a bad one, for I felt in a very strange and uncomfortable situation. There were, of course, many spectators. I just thank them for their kind and dutiful attention. Lady Harvey's carriage waited at the end of the wharf to convey Field and the two clergymen to Government House. Field recorded that it took 7 or 8 minutes to pass through the town to Government House, where the governor received him along with Lady Harvey, their eldest son, the son's wife, and Captain Elliot. After dinner, alone in his room at Government House, Field reflected on the day and the manner of his reception. A Tractarian and a defender of high church ideals, Field gave the reception a mixed review, writing that the introduction to his new diocese was, quote, "not in very primitive or apostolic style, yet I should hope as not to give offense to any high-minded Christians. The respect and ceremony were shown to me and accepted by me as a bishop of the church. And though I would have preferred a procession with litanies and holy services and priests and choristers, yet where none could be found to make or understand them, the mixture of ecclesiastical with secular ceremony was not contemptuously to be rejected. To me individually, it was very distasteful, but that helped to reconcile me to it and made me hope it might be of use to others, if God please." End quote. This concern over the mixture of the ecclesiastical with the secular, as Field put it, was to become a dominant force during his tenure in Newfoundland. Although he struggled to accept the conditions under which he was greeted, Field recognized that the ceremony served a purpose in the hearts and minds of the people, and likely further endeared them to the church. The Benevolent Irish Society was frequently involved in parading to and fro from their meeting house to the wharf to meet and see off prominent members of colonial society. And I'll bring up another picture here that I think sort of illustrates the bowl-shaped nature of the city to give you a sense of how people would meet and then parade down to the numerous finger piers throughout the harbor here. And I find it very interesting, it's always noted at whose wharf someone landed, right? And what an honor it would be to have the bishop come ashore at your wharf. So, a couple of anecdotes involving the Benevolent Irish Society marching to and from the water. In April of 1847, their records for the arrival of Governor Gaspard Le Marchand provide a glimpse into the system of flags and signals that would be used on Signal Hill, which you can just see, which would be the hill at the bottom right corner here, that would be used to announce the arrival of ships into the harbor. Patrick Morris, the Society's president, explained beforehand that he would make the necessary inquiries on what way the governor would land, whether public or private. Morris went on to instruct the group that if the landing were public, the Society would be notified to that effect, and they would assemble immediately at the Orphan Asylum School on St. George's Cross, being placed under the packet signal and hoisted at the hill, which signal will indicate the governor to be on board. The Society will then proceed to the Queen's Wharf to receive His Excellency on his landing, end quote. In other years, the governor's people would coordinate with the Benevolent Irish Society and other groups, sending someone ashore while the governor's ship remained moored in the harbor until suitable preparations for his landing were made. Here, the pattern of events that triggered a procession to the wharf is made clear. Upon the sight of a vessel approaching the Narrows, flags would be raised on Signal Hill. People's daily routines could be interrupted at any time in order to carry out plans that had previously been decided on and which now lay in waiting. Skipping ahead a little bit here because I'm concerned about time. I think the way that these events are often recorded in society minute books and in newspapers also speaks to sort of unique geographical concerns of St. John's, such as recording the wharf from which someone arrived, or as I previously mentioned, this is a city that's very connected in the summer to the wider Atlantic world, but in the wintertime less so. Very little traffic is able to come in and out of the harbor during the winter months. In January 1841, Catholic Bishop Michael Anthony Fleming departed St. John's shortly before he would have been unable to depart because the harbor would have frozen over. He was on his way to travel to Europe to secure materials for the Roman Catholic Cathedral then under construction. The Irish Society commended Fleming for choosing to, quote, hazard upon the ocean a life so valuable to your people at such a season, end quote. And Fleming's reply to the Irish Society illustrates how the seasonal pattern of work on the cathedral ebbed and flowed with the availability of materials, many of which were imported, and also ebbed and flowed with the patterns of the seasonal fishery. Fleming wrote to the Irish Society that this was his only choice of season at which to go, and he hoped to be back in Newfoundland before the sealing vessels returned from the ice in March or April. This way he would have the whole summer season handy to oversee and direct construction on the cathedral. Apart from festive occasions such as those having to do with the departure and arrival of governors and bishops, the harbor remained the city's focal point during its day-to-day operations. I already mentioned the complex system of flags that informed the people at large as much as merchant houses of comings and goings in the harbor. Richard Bonnycastle of the Royal Engineers noted in 1842, quote, "A mighty fondness for flags is one of the prevailing signs of this place. Every merchant has his flag on his storehouse or wharf, and one would think that the utmost state of active warfare existed by only looking on the military signal post, which is frequently kept in sharp practice, signaling the highly important intelligence that a schooner is passing the harbor, that a ship, brig, or schooner is in sight, and I have seen the three masts and yards look like a linen draper's shop from the quantity of cloth hanging in the wind. This all appears very childish to a military man," Bonnycastle wrote, "but still it is of utility, as the merchant is at once told that his vessel is in sight a short time before it comes in, and as far as the packet is concerned, it serves to inform the owner, the post office, and the town in due time. But owing to this place's long connection with sea affairs, this has all been carried to excess," end quote. Almost any entry chosen at random from the copious journals kept by banker and later politician Edward Morris also reveals a preoccupation with harbor traffic, even from a man whose own business was not directly linked to transatlantic trade. One never knew what news and information would come into the harbor from day to day. On September 27, 1854, for instance, Morris wrote that his friend John Kent had received word from his wife visiting Ireland that she would be delayed there for some time. Other news that day included Mr. O'Dwyer, who had arrived by the packet boat with a second wife, and the arrival of Morris's friend, Mr. Thomas. Morris frequently recorded the arrival and departure of friends who left for visits, which vessel they went on, and from whose wharf they departed. And he was particularly concerned with recording the name of the first vessel to enter the harbor in the spring, and with recording the name and catch of the most successful sealing vessels every year. Although it remained center stage in the city's layout and a center of commercial activity, transportation, and news, the waterfront began to decline as a respectable residential address, as the town continued its shift from seasonal outpost to permanent settlement and colonial capital. By mid-century, and even earlier, really, many residents expressed concerns over the unsanitary and crowded nature of the two main commercial streets, Duckworth and Water Street, which ran parallel to the harbor. Although they maintained their status as commercial hubs, these two main streets were widely known as fire hazards. And these fears came to pass in the winter of 1817, when a fire broke out on Duckworth Street and whose quick spread was attributed to the crowded nature of the street. Even in the wake of this fire, Duckworth was rebuilt in much of the same sort of haphazard fashion, and many merchants began to abandon the practice of living above their shop and decamped to homes that were further from the commercial district, on Prescott and Cochrane Streets, Forest Road, and in the country, which would have been near Kitty Vitty Lake. So they sort of decamped from these two main drags here going along the harbor to this area up here would have been known as Forest Road. Kitty Vitty Lake would be sort of off in this direction. And these sort of become the more respectable residential areas. I would argue that the development development of more strictly delineated residential and commercial districts also probably speaks to the growing number of women and children resident in St. John's at this time, and to Victorian ideals of separate spheres. With the shift from outposts defined by work and trade to permanent settlement where families, homes, and social life took on more importance, the shape of the city and the use of certain spaces changed as well. Business and leisure, public and private, became delineated in the city's geography in a way that they had not been before. Yet even while the middle classes moved their homes away from the harbor remained the city's focal point and center of activity. I'll come back to my map again. Around the mid-19th century, there's this burst of public works construction in St. John's. This is also about the time that the city that Newfoundland becomes a colony in the sense that it gets a legislature, it gets representative, and then later responsible government. So the Colonial building is built up around here. The street sort of at the back of town is called Military Road. And this is where the Roman Catholic Cathedral is built. It's where the Colonial building is built. It's where Government House is built. It's where sort of anything nice that was built at mid-century was sort of put at the top of the hill here. And so although it's far from, the dirty, smelly waterfront streets, it still provides a great vantage point of the harbor. And I would say, that this wasn't done accidentally, that you can still see from these buildings everything that's coming and going and what's happening around the city, but you're just able to do it in a more, you can see but not smell or hear what's happening in the city. I think that the harbor also, in the imaginations of people in the city at this time, the harbor was sort of a liminal place. Joseph Jukes, an English geologist hired by the colonial government in 1844, illustrates this in some of his writings. He talks about how much bustle and business is going on in the harbor, and he starts to describe St. John's as sort of a mini metropolis to the rest of the colony. He makes St. John's his base while he goes out conducting his geological survey. And the harbor, for someone, because he travels so much, the harbor sort of appears as this border space in the way he writes. For instance, when he's coming back to town after a trip, he is always embarrassed by how unkempt he is when disembarking, and he talks about how on his way from the wharf to his lodging that he hopes he doesn't run into anyone he knows because he's so disheveled. And on another occasion, he's terribly disappointed at having to anchor just outside of the harbor while experiencing high winds on a return trip to the city. And he writes, "If the wind were but fair, I might have been in St. John's, lolling on a sofa, reading letters, or going to dine with the governor. But instead, Jukes was stuck in this space just outside of town. He was thrilled by the working class affectations that his travels allowed him to experience, but he always looked forward to their end when he would once more be in the city, greeted by a warm fire and a meal with more respectable company than those who accompanied him on his survey." If the harbor was the threshold to a wider world, it was still accepted that that world was far away. That is why the transatlantic telegraph cable seemed to spark such interest among people in the city. In the summer of 1857, special events were held throughout the colony to mark the laying of the first transatlantic cable from Heart's Content in Trinity Bay, Newfoundland to Western Ireland. So although the cable doesn't originate at St. John's, people in the city are very excited about it nonetheless. And 18-year-old Joseph Howley, who was never one to stray much from the itinerary of farming, hunting, and who he visited in his journal, devoted 4 journal entries that summer to the transatlantic cable. One can only wonder what effect the cable's installation had on the psyche of this young man whose family had always maintained close connections to Ireland. Did the cable make him think about his brother Richard, studying for the priesthood at All Hallows College in Dublin? And did Joseph feel that these new technologies somehow brought him closer? Although this first iteration of a transatlantic cable wire soon failed, and although John Howley would be the least traveled of his many siblings, and never seemed to express much of an interest in venturing much farther into the world beyond the barrens and hills of the greater St. John's area, His imagination was fired by the possibility of such rapid transatlantic communication. The town at large appeared equally caught up in the fervor. Howley recorded an illumination, ball, and regatta to mark the cable's installation. I'll conclude with one final anecdote. Sorry, you don't get to see these. Talk to me afterwards. Just a reflection on my own research process. So I spent most of summer 2012 at the Provincial Archives of Newfoundland, also known as the Rooms, which is the building at top center here. And this building was built in 2005, and it houses the Provincial Museum, Art Gallery, and Archives. And it was a lovely working space. And as I sat in the reading room with this great view over the harbor, a mini panopticon, if you will, I started to as I'm reading the diaries of these people and reading about their travels and their business affairs, I could almost see this mental map taking shape. And it was very useful for me to think about, to just walk to the window and say, okay, his wharf would have been here, his shop would have been here, the church, the cathedral is still here. So I found that a very interesting vantage point, and I think some of that sort of came into my thesis in a way which wasn't originally intended to be about landscape, but sort of became about it anyway. It was a great vantage point, and in my photo contest entry for the network in environmental history, I wrote about how this vantage point was a place to contemplate the relationship between space and power in both the colonial town and the modern city. So just kind of an interesting reflection for me anyway on how our surroundings sometimes might influence how we approach our project. And I will conclude at that. Thank you.
That's my gig. Briefly. I'd like to thank first both of you, and you get to come and sit up here now. You get to come and sit up here and take questions. Couple from me, and then I hope the rest from everybody else. I want to keep my remarks very short. Though it's interesting. I read abstracts. I hate to say it last night. Didn't spend a lot of time preparing. Not days and days. But what struck me again today was how landscape comes up in both of these in very interesting ways. And this is landscape both in time of place, specific place, but also imaginary landscapes, and how imaginary landscapes change, how landscape influences how understandings, how one understands yourself and the rest of the world, and how that changes then in specific time and place. And whether it's landscapes, you talked, Brittney, about commemorative landscapes, and you were talking about physical landscapes, but both of them are imaginary. Both of them are as much imaginary as they are anything else. They're also very much tied into, and this is, for those who've done a course with me know that it becomes an increasing, it's one of the things we talk about more and more, is identities, right? And both of these papers, though yours says it's Imperial, I would say it's Colonial. Right? It's a very interesting, and so is yours, Angela, this sort of colonial experience that I'm part of a colonial world that doesn't really want to be part of a colonial world. I want to go beyond the colonial, and I don't necessarily want national, right? These are not nation-building exercises that are going on here. And I don't think that there's any aspiration of that. Though maybe, Brittney, with yours, but I'm not even sure that you could say Joseph Brant's a nation-building exercise as we would understand it in today's historiographical debates. But they are exercises that someone like Kenneth Lockridge would understand when he talks about self-fashioning, right? And self-fashioning and how one fashions self to be as good, if not better than, and yet at the same time can never quite make it. And so I was quite fascinated how both papers in interesting and quite different ways reflect some of those issues. And it's something that I would like both of you in your own work to think about pursuing, that sort of I know Angela's doing it specifically. Now, some specific questions. And Brittney, and I know you didn't have time to bring it up, but I would like you at some point in the next 10 minutes, 5 minutes, to talk about both the differences in terms of understanding of race and masculinity that emerges in these two monuments. And the reason for that is that I think that it's interesting that Brant is so much locked into time and space and where the impetus for that comes from, which is coming at exactly the same time initially that First Nations, particularly the Six Nations, have gone to London to represent themselves. They have presented themselves to the Prince of Wales. They are reasserting self and place. And it's interesting that they choose Brant to do that. But then how it gets understood by the other, i.e. white society. And Brock, I'm not so sure that Brock becomes the gentleman hero even at the end of or in the middle of the 19th century, as you suggest. And you may well be right, because I also wonder if he isn't mythologized earlier, but in different ways and by different people. Certainly the work that I've done on the War of 1812, they talk about him as an Upper Canadian hero by the end of 1812, right? He's been dead a month and a half. And he's an Upper Canadian hero. This is why he's us, in interesting ways. And I think that changes, and I don't think it gets reflected in the monument, but be careful, I think, about how mythology changes as well, and understanding of mythology. And Angela, one of the questions that I think that, and Angela, I've talked about this before, I hate to say it, I'm her supervisor, is the relationship between class and how you understand class and landscape fits into all of this. Because this world that you've been talking about today, which is, and I think there's some really evocative stuff coming out of this landscape thing that you're doing. The world that you were talking about is the world of a middling-ish, gentlemanly, respectable sorts. How does that, but that's a world that these folks can also know includes the folks who stink at the bottom, right? They know it's the fisher people, the fishermen. They know it's the people who are, who are hauling the carts, who are hauling the fish, who are doing all that good stuff. And yet, they don't seem to be part of that landscape. And I don't know whether it's just because they don't write about them, or we don't see them, or in the pictures they're not there. This is a pristine, I mean, I know it's not pristine, but it's pristine in terms of the only folks who live there are those people who seem to be writing about it. And I wonder what the implications of that are. So it's colonial, but it's colonial it's a colonial middle class. This is a world that's not real, even as they see it. Yeah. Right? Anyway, I could blather on forever. I'm going to ask you to just, if you could talk briefly, and then we'll open it up to questions. While you do that, I'm going to get a coffee. Go for it.
Well, in terms of the differences in understandings of race and masculinity, I'm just starting to delve really deeply into how Joseph Brant was understood, and I've been fascinated to learn that it's almost overemphasized that he was a gentleman, that he was a leader, and there's definitely it's a counter discourse to the savagery narrative of him being this brutal, ruthless warrior that was kind of a little bit more from the beginning, and there is definitely, from every account that I have read, the same language being used of Brant being this very proper British. They mention almost all the time he wrote and spoke English, he was a Christian, and it is overly emphasized, to the point where Brock is almost assumed. And although they mention his kind of qualities in terms of leadership and his chivalry is mentioned all the time, how he would show mercy on the battlefield to dying soldiers, it's his masculine attributes I have found so far in the discourse is assumed. Now, of course, his giant column is another expression of masculinity that I do explore a little bit further in the paper in terms of its iconography. I don't think the two are linked, but certainly there is Brant. The discourse around Brant is going against more common tropes of the First Nations masculinity, while Brock is assumed to have them already. And in terms of your point about the gentleman hero, I'm still trying to wrap myself around, because Brock changes as a hero. He changes from the time when he dies to the 7 different funerals. Everyone is different, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around what changes, why it changes, and how to articulate that change. And I need to also define, I think, a little more clearly what I mean by the gentleman hero. It's very common in British literature that I've been reading about, but no one really talks about it. So it's time to define exactly what I mean by it, and I think I'll be able to make that transition a little more clear.
Thank you, Brittney. Angela?
In response to your question, I think class is really obviously a very tricky issue in this paper, and the landscape, it's something that I sort of struggle with, late at night when you're wondering why am I doing this anyway, is that I don't want this paper to be, a story about, the brave pioneers who came and built a place, and they were the only ones who left sources, so they're the only ones that I'm writing about. And I worry that, I give too much attention to these people. And it would be really interesting to know how, I had this really great anecdote that I didn't include in the presentation it was a newspaper editor talking about this merchant watching his sealing fleet come in, and he's standing maybe on Signal Hill watching the vessel approach, and he sees that they've been very successful, and the newspaper editor says, in his mind, he probably thought back to his mansion under construction in Liverpool and realized that this was his ticket home, and that he would be able to, leave the business to his son, and he could go back and retire in luxury. And it would be really interesting to know how does the imaginary landscape differ for the men who actually were on that vessel, and what is the imagined world beyond the harbor like for them, who actually have to go to the ice floes. And so it's a hard question to answer, and it's a hard question without sources. And I think travel writing might be one way to go at it, because people who visit a place temporarily are a lot more inclined to say negative things about it than people who live there might be. Yes.
Brittney, you've fleshed out a lot of what I was wondering about, but I thought I'd still pose this, and it's about the Brant statue, and it's a really interesting thing, especially when you get into the representation of Brant himself, and what you're saying about the clothes and how it's been made sort of more other. But there's also that sort of comment, there's the not quite British, and when taking into account the investment and who invested into it, and the Six Nations being heavily involved in that. And if this question sounds entirely ignorant, I apologize. I know nothing about Canadian history. I'm a British historian. But is there any degree to which this is part of is motivated in some way by the Six Nations resisting assimilation? Is there any element to that? Is that not quite Britishness a point of retention of we're not fully joining into this larger imperial project? Is that a discourse that's at play at all in this issue, or is there some element of agency in the Six Nations that needs to be articulated in that?
That is a great question that I am trying to find more responses from the Six Nations. They contributed money. They wanted this monument constructed, but then they kind of fall off. There's no mention of them in the speeches. As far as I know, no one gave a speech. It was actually Blackfoot chiefs that gave a speech. So they suddenly get unincluded, even though they remain on the board and on the committee. There seemed to be a major fight that broke out about a year before the monument was unveiled, and committee meeting minutes are strangely gone. But I'm still trying to uncover what that fight could be, because it could be First Nations trying to articulate their own vision of Brant, which it's been very difficult to find during this period. Certainly Brant has been resurrected as a figure from the Six Nations more recently. Mm-hmm. However, their reaction at the time and how they wanted Brant represented, as far as I know, really, they didn't have as much control as the amount of money that they gave to the project would.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yes? Yep.
Two questions, one for each of you. Angela, is there any evidence of what I would call oppositional performance? You talked about how these good burghers perform to demonstrate their respectability. But I remember social historians like Michael Cross talking about 19th century, what he called recreational violence. So some beer, go after some Catholics or whatever. Surely down on the waterfront, there would have been this sort of acting out and sort of, I remember reading Gunn's book on politics in Newfoundland, and this tension between the outports and how when the magistrate arrived from St. John's with his little trooper man, you know, they would just ignore them. Was there any evidence of other kinds of performance?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Yeah, I think in one anecdote that really comes to mind is, of course, they outlaw mummering, right, in the 1830s. And today, you hear of mummers and you think of quaint little people dress up at Christmas and they go knock on doors. But it wasn't. It was more in the 19th century. It was more of almost the chivalry type thing, where it was a way to dress up and anonymously beat up on people who you disapproved of. And so that, of course, is happening in St. John's in the 19th century, and it's happening in a lot of other places in the island as well. Particularly during elections, usually someone running who someone thinks shouldn't be running, and it gets to a point where mummering is outlawed. So I think that would be maybe one example of something that comes to mind. Yeah, I'm definitely still at a point in the project where I am talking about the parades, but this oppositional performance that you talk of is something that I need to give more attention to.
And Brittney, I have one quick question for you. We went to a lecture a while ago, someone from Parks Canada, maybe Phil Goldring, I can't remember, and he was talking about the historic plaque, the federal plaque program. And he said their experience had shown that the natives and the Dene, he was also talking about, at first didn't want to engage the plaques. It didn't fit their kind of memory psychology. They don't remember things by place. They remember them through an oral tradition. But he said they seemed to catch on that this was what the white man wanted. So we'll play that game. We'll use their desire to have a plaque to say that, Batosh or something happened here. Because it will be a chip for us to play against them for other advantage. And I'm just wondering if that went on with Brant. The fact that, how the fundraising took place, who spoke at it. Was this an intrinsic sort of desire on their part to have a white man's monument, or do they think this is what the white man will ingratiate us to the white man?
It's an interesting question, and the letter that they wrote to Prince Arthur in 1874, kind of outlining why we'd like this monument, is very much in the language of, you put monuments to your heroes, this is our hero, he deserves a monument. So I think it could go very much either way. I'm fairly certain that the Six Nations were highly invested in having a monument to Joseph Brant, who, even from his death onwards, was, I don't like using the word hero when I don't have to, but it was very much a leader and a respected leader. Now, why they chose to engage in a monument, that's a question that I don't think is really revealed in that letter, other than I do agree. I think the Six Nations understood, we have this monument now to our hero, we can be part of this and use it to gain some interests that might be important to them at the time. And of course, the Six Nations at this time was also emerging as a fairly important nation and an important group to both Ontario and then to themselves. So there was a bit of there was definitely an awareness that having this white man's monument would be important in terms of the negotiation and asserting their presence, certainly in the Brantford area.
Any other questions?
Those are interesting papers. I have a question for each of you. First, Angela, do you think some of the court or the church charity records in your period might give you a look at the underclasses and some of their expressions?
Court records, definitely. Church charity records are a little bit harder to come by. I do have the Benevolent Irish Society. I do have a lot of their records of various charitable endeavors that they were undertaking. But it seems like so many of these groups, you know, they were a charitable organization in name, but were mostly a social organization.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking of somebody like Bishop Spencer, who was in Bermuda as well, and I'm thinking about, you know, some of his correspondence with the SPG in places. Now, I know he was in Newfoundland as well, so I'm wondering, you know.
Yeah, definitely, I should look into
Those are
that.
really good. And what about boredom as a factor in all this? I know it's not one of the axes of difference, but, you know.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, the winters are long and the nights are long, and people want to go to events and have something to do. And but I think what I'm getting at is this sort of transformation. It goes from being, you know, just a seasonal post to a place that people actually are immigrating to.
Yeah, but they're spending the winter then.
Yeah.
And then we're seeing they're trying to make all these complex things, which are, as well as an important cultural manifestation, they're also something to do. Brittney, that was a fascinating paper. And what I'm wondering about is you talk about the 7 funerals of Sir Isaac Cromwell. What was actually on the site between the blowing up of the first monument and the building of the second one?
The old monument in a big pile of rubble.
So just rubble was there?
Pretty much half of the monument was still standing, and then eventually it started to fall down.
And did I understand you to say that at one point in the first monument there was a plan to bury him on top of it?
And the very first one, yes, to put a mausoleum at the very top of it. The column was meant to be very, very large, and there is a staircase in the current monument, but there was going to be this very large grand staircase.
Either that, you just crunch him all up.
Yeah.
like a Peruvian in a jar. Yeah. So there was something. Oh, I know. The other thing I was interested in is the depiction of the other Aboriginals on the statue. Because, you know, when I think of C.W. Jeffries doing Champlain, you know, looking, and the Indians are in the proper. I notice they also get the passive Indian, though, the acquiescent Indian, you know, who's like the classical nymph, the 4, is it 4 or 2 at each side?
There's 3 on each side to
Yeah.
represent the 6.
That's good. And now, what about Brock as a gay ancestor? I mean, because that's a whole dimension of Brock that's arisen since all of this.
Yes, that is becoming my fascinating little side project.
Yeah, because I think that really is fascinating.
It is.
And it
It's
goes back quite a
absolutely
long way, though,
fascinating.
doesn't it?
It does.
What's the story here?
That Brock is reputed to have been homosexual rather than heterosexual. So some in the in queer culture in Canada, there has been a kind of line of interest in him as a form.
Is there much evidence for this? I mean,
It's a myth.
Yeah, it is.
We don't need evidence, dear.
It's very much.
Oh, come on, you two. We're not playing that out here.
Sorry, Brittney. I want
It's
to.
fine. It's very much building on his. There isn't much evidence known, first of all, but I guess people who use this as a myth have turned back to accounts of him really being friendly with ladies, only having female friends, actually not being a very good leader, in fact not being quite as respected as a leader as we remember him as. The evidence is very circumstantial, but the fact that it did develop, there are echoes of it in Centennial of 1912, those are echoes, and that's my fascination with the side project, is how it started to develop. And with the bicentennial, there's lots of discussion.
That's a terrific article, really.
Yeah.
Yes. And then, oh, sorry, who we got? Oh, Jerry, go first. You gotta wait.
Well, I just wanted to comment on the memorial to Brant. As a kid growing up in Brantford, I was amongst a whole generation in the 40s and into the 50s of a sensitivity to the history of Aboriginal peoples. And we were made in public school to made aware of this important heritage in the local life. And so what impressed me, and I think lots of others growing up in my generation in the city, was looking at the monument and seeing Brant in native costume, but maybe even more importantly, the figures around the base of the monument, who were also in native costume, as representing a kind of, I'm searching for the right word, but a celebration of this history. And it was, if you compare that monument to the Brock Monument, which is triumphalist and as you say, has obvious male symbolism to it, what you see in the Brant Monument, at least what I always thought I saw, was something much more modest. It's lower in height. The figures are visible, whereas on the Brock Monument you can't really see Brock. The bas reliefs around the bottom are, I think there are 4 of them. Is that right?
Yeah.
Show Six Nations, purport to show Six Nations people in different aspects of their lives, mainly warlike activity, but that's what Brant was, a war leader. But he was also a leader of his people. He was not a particularly good manager of the vast tracts of land that were granted to the Six Nations. In fact, he gave most of it away, I understand, to pals and supplicants and so on. So what I'm trying to say here is that the impact of the monument in the local community was, at least to school kids, who were paraded down there to the square fairly regularly, and went voluntarily too, because the Carnegie Library is just across the street, which housed a county museum that was filled with Indian artifacts. Have you ever seen it? Yeah. Well, in my day, it had a lot of that. So there was a kind of incipient, a beginning of the recognition of the Six Nations heritage, of you might say, the ethnic diversity of at least the local community. Not in a very liberal way necessarily, but at least the beginnings of attempting to convey to the locals, especially the children, a sense of that history. I don't know if there's anything worth commenting on there, but it certainly made a kind of impact that I think was, how would I say, positive, that had a lasting effect, I think, on many of us.
Thank you very much for that comment. I can't understate this is pretty much the only grand monument to a member of the First Nations in Ontario, and can overemphasize how significant that is. And I could tell that early on it was certainly respected by the local community, but I didn't have anything for a little bit later, although I do know it was vandalized about 20 years ago, and there was a huge outcry. Items were stolen from the monument. there seemed to be a big rally of the local community around how important this monument still was to the community. But thank you for filling in that middle space.
We have time for at least one more question. Stephen, and then, I don't know, Peter, did you have one or not? Oh, no. Super. All right, Peter goes first. Sorry, Stephen, you have to wait.
Okay, just a quick question for you, Brittney, because you mentioned briefly correspondence with the Prime Minister's office. I think it's with the Brant monument. And I wanted to, it reminded me of Alan Gordon's article on Jean Cartier, the Quadricentennial, and the very direct and very personal involvement of Bennett with the Cartier monument. How much do you see direct influence or involvement from the very top, from the PMO?
Well, Sir Johnny MacDonald was going to come. He sent a reply that he was planning to come, but then, strangely enough, in his regrets, he said he couldn't come because of the stresses of dealing with the Northwest Rebellion and the aftermath of that, because he actually ventured out west not long after, and that was his reply. But this is the only monument I have where there is actually correspondence directly with the Prime Minister still surviving. And it seemed that Sir Johnny MacDonald rather liked the project, and he did petition in Parliament for money to be granted to it, which eventually wasn't, but he did apparently.
Stephen. So just a quick question for Angela. Did all the societies or a lot of the societies come out to greet people, or was it just certain societies that would usually come out?
Depends on who was coming.
Oh, okay.
The Irish Society always go to greet the Catholic bishop. When the governor comes, because they have a seasonal governor up until 1818, so he's coming every summer, and so. Yes, they come out to greet him, and there's always an order of precedence too, which you'll see in the newspaper. So it's really interesting to see who gets to march, right behind the governor's carriage, and who is further at the back. And so depending on who's coming, but for the most part, they're all out there. It's just a question of who gets prime vantage point.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I just have one quick question for Brittney. I'm interested about, you talk a lot about the creation of these monuments, which is really interesting, the contests that they held. But I'm wondering about the publicity that these monuments received afterwards, and the kinds of visitors that were attending these sites following the opening of these memorials. In particular, I'm wondering, is there any kind of encouragement for people to visit? Are there visitor guides for these local areas that are saying this is a really important spot that you need to consider when visiting this spot? Just because my own interests are in travel during the 19th century. So I wonder if that's something that features in publicity for the different areas, and if you've found anything that sort of reflects reactions to them.
It's a good question. With Brant, no. Not many people are visiting Brantford. There just isn't pamphlets being produced on, but with Brock, absolutely. He starts being featured in why you should go to the Niagara region. When you're visiting St. Catharines, you go and visit Brock's monument. It was actually a very large tourist draw, especially the first monument, so the one that was bombed in 1840. The second monument, the space is kind of transformed into a recreational area. And people go there for company picnics, there's baseball diamonds, there's someone actually doing work. I believe she just finished her dissertation. Her name slips me, but I can get it to you. Who actually does work on tourism at Brock's Monument and Queenston Heights, and the tourism that followed the building and how it was then transformed from this is a monument to a war hero to this is where we go play baseball. And it is an interesting transformation that does begin to happen as Brock's memory starts to fade a little bit. Then it just keeps coming back and growing. But if you are interested in that, there's someone doing work on it. And it is quite fascinating how quickly it goes from a commemorative landscape to a recreational. There's another topic.
All right, so we are going to leave at 3:30. Before you do, I would like you please to join me and say thank you.